Polypede Works here, coming to you once again with the big chapter 1150, Dami Reversi. So, this is a chapter of One Piece, boy, I gotta tell you. There's a lot to unpack here. A lot. But first, let's just cover the cover story, in which we have volume 34 of the Yamato cover story, in which she is returning Yashue's katana to the Enma Shrine in Hakumai, bringing the initial pilgrimage to an end. However, we do see Oti holding Kawamatsu's hat, so they have to deliver that. So I'm guessing now the cover story is going to be a bunch of little side quests. They give Kawamatsu his hat, but then something else happens, and so on and so forth. So that's the idea, I guess, of how things are going to go. Now, as you may or may not know, I have been in the One Piece community for a very, very long time, and I have observed many a thing over many a year. 10 years ago, there was a rumor. The rumor has validity now, because what the rumor was that there was some sort of manga leak, and I'll post what I found on Reddit from 10 years ago up here somewhere, but there was a manga leak saying that eventually Luffy would have to fight an army of demons with his army of pirates, and that was the rumor. I never thought the rumor would come to volition, but in this chapter, here we are, because Imu's ability is literally the devil. Now, on top of that, before we start getting into the significant bits, I made a video about how I thought Marshall D. Teach, otherwise known as Blackbeard, was going to have a mythical bat fruit that gave him the powers of the devil. Well, I was wrong on that, because Imu has that fruit. It has to be a bad fruit, because in the chapter proper, once Imu transforms Gunko, we see that Gunko has these big bat succubus wings, a arrow-shaped tail, and is carrying a Triton. So everybody, myself included, saying that it was so curious that Gunko had these weird vector powers like how Imu had way back when Sabo and Cobra were fighting the elders. That was legitimate. And now we know that was the tail of Imu. I think people called that too, though I was of the impression, and I think there's a video coming out soon, that Imu was a snake. But now there may be a video about Blackbeard being that snake. We'll get into that another day. But this is crazy. So, about that army of demons bit, Gunko, possessed by Imu, has the ability to, first of all, manifest a Triton. But what they are also doing is manifesting magic circles, and it seems as though weapons and items come out of these magic circles. So, the first one that we see is a book. That book contains a giant double-barrel pistol and a dagger, right? She stabs Broggy with the dagger and then shoots his arm off, which is initially crazy within itself. Now, before we get any further, is this a devil fruit? Of course it is. Of course it is. The reason why this is so interesting here is because all of this started off with a joke initially, if you recall. Way back in the pre-time skip, where Kuma paw patted Brook away and he landed on that island where the occultists were doing a ritual, they thought they had summoned Satan with their magic circle. So it's funny now that the person whom Imu is possessing knew Brook personally, and now Imu is possessing Gunko and becoming that devil. We also now know that the magic circles are a power of Imu. That goes without saying. That's actually true. So Imu summons another magic circle, and there's a little translator's note saying that the attack, which is called Demon Contract A Quarrel, could be a reference to this Canadian author whose name is A.E. Van Gogh, and his mythical creature is called the Coral, which is from a short story he wrote called The Black Destroyer. And the Coral are this alien species that look like these big black panthers with tentacles. So, I don't know, maybe. It's strange because Broggy doesn't turn into a panther. He just turns into an ore-sized demonic version of himself. And from this, we know, too, that the powers of the five elders aren't related to Imu in this way. They have their own separate powers apart from Imu. Because of the relationship they have with Imu, they, like the Holy Knights, get all these special abyss and magic circle privileges and all that, and the whole telepathy thing. But they have their own abilities. Because it's very telling that the whole transformation thing that Imu was doing is just an extension of this presumed demonic bat fruit. Because Dory gets big teeth, big horns, and then a black weapon with bat wings. He looks like Imu. Now, the weird thing about it is that Imu severs his arm, but as a demon, he can hold his transformed axe with his severed arm. So I don't know if the arm is in the process of regenerating, which could mean that all the regeneration, at least in the weird fleshy way, like with Saturn, that could be attributed to Imu, but I'm not sure. Because again, regeneration or revival has been mentioned when talking about awakened Zoans way back in Impel Down. So I don't know if that's an Imu granted ability, but based on what Dory and Broggy look like, it's telling that this is a Imu specific transformation. Whereas the diversity of the five elders most likely points to them having separate devil fruit powers, mostly all mythical. Again, I don't know about Jupiter, who was the worm. So yes, Dory and Broggy turn to demons. The rest of their men become demons, all of which look like Imu. And then in the way that it looks as though they've been flipped upside down, like their morals have been inversed. And the actual process of this transformation is called Dark Inverse Domain Dami Reversi. So the demonic contract, a quarrel, I'm guessing is the start, because we see once that's said, Broggy is encircled with a magic circle, and then the trigger is the dark inversion domain Dami Reversi. So that actually is what turns all the giant warriors into a army of demons, like was mentioned in that rumor 10 years ago. So that's interesting. However, is this out the ordinary from what we've seen before? Not really. Because if you recall, way back in Wano, Queen developed a virus that turned people into ice demons or ice onis. So this is just like a devil fruit version of that, which is interesting within itself. We've seen magical dimensions before, like with the darkness fruit, or the bog fruit / swamp fruit that Caribou has. We've seen it with a Blamenco, who had the pocket fruit. So dimensions aren't weird, or objects holding other things aren't weird. Matter of fact, going back to the previous chapter, we see Raizo, and Raizo had a similar ability in the scroll fruit, in which he could seal things within his scrolls, like such as water and Kaido's blast breath. So all the powers Imu is showing now have been shown off in the series beforehand. So these aren't a big surprise, because mythical Zoans do have the powers of a paramecia, so I'm not shocked. Another thing too that I just want to point out, since we're on the subject, since this is all what the chapter is about, Gunko does not have a Hagoromo scar. So this could just be the basic set of what Imu could do, and is using anyone with a contract of the Abyss as a vessel. Now, their preference for female bodies makes me think it might only work on those the same gender as the user. That may be a stipulation, because it's weird that Emu picked her and not Sommers or Killingham. You know, that's strange to me. Why specifically Gunko? And now Gunko's heterochromia is gone, by the way. That's another weird thing. And like I mentioned in a video way beforehand talking about ringed eyes, that seems to be a sign of soul swapping, because we see that when Lost swaps the souls of the Straw Hats, all their eyes change. Nami has Sanji's eyes, Sanji had Chopper's eyes, Chopper's body was emoting like Frankie and had similar pupils and eyelashes to Frankie. So that too has been a thing that we've seen before. So again, even here, I don't know if that's a visual cue or just how things literally are when soul takeover is going on. I don't think the person with the ringed irises themselves is possessed. I think that in itself is a biological thing, though that is reflected when the ringed eye person is taking over someone else. So like Mihawk, Emu, and possibly Caribou are all in their right bodies, unless Emu is possessing Lily through the powers of the Op fruit. Don't know about that. But here with Gunko, I think is just a sign that yes, Emu is now piloting Gunko's body. What this still reminds me of too, and I talked about this in my Ringed Irises video, it reminds me of what Mihawk weirdly does when the leveling is going on. It's worded as if he can perceive what is happening miles and miles away. This also reminds me of Eniru, because Eniru very uniquely is the only Logia in the series who has combined any of his haki with his Devil Fruit, because using his observation haki called Mantra at the time, and with the powers of the Rumble Fruit, he could sense people around the island like a radar. And looking at Isa, the little girl from Skypiea, we know that just a good proficiency in haki is genetic. And we see that with Conqueror's haki too. It just happens like that sometimes. Haki just comes about. So I think that too could be what's going on here with Emu and how they are able to perceive things with their Devil Fruit. They're combining their Devil Fruit with their good observation haki, much like Eniru, and they have the power to perceive long distances, much like Mihawk, presumably. At least that's what I think at this moment. But to continue. With that being said, all the demon-turned warriors of Elbaf are marching out with the newly revived nightmare creatures to take the head of Jarl Mountainbeard. So, another thing that we find out in this chapter is that you can't really kill the nightmare creatures brought into the world by Killingham, as they can continue to pour in through dream holes, which is weird. I don't know, but then again, we never actually get to see the creation of the nightmare creatures. It's just weird that they're tied to a hole in reality that Killingham can make. I just think that's weird. But yeah, they can continue on coming out and they don't necessarily die because Killingham can just say a word and they're right back up. Much like regular awakened Zoans or failed awakened Zoans, because they too could get knocked out and get right back up. They could self-revive. So a lot of very similar traits and powers going on here. It's all very interesting. But yeah, I was wrong about Teach having this ability. Emu has it. Now, one last thing before we end off, because I covered quite a bit in a short amount of time. But I think if Blackbeard was going to get an ability, it most likely would be this or something equivalent to this. Because the mural now is looking very, very suspicious, because we know Emu is the demon in that mural. We know the Nika figure obviously is Luffy. That leaves the dragon and the serpent. Dragon, meaning Monkey D. Dragon, will be the dragon in that mural, and the serpent most likely will be Blackbeard. I can see that happening. And I gotta do a big revision video about that because the more I think about it, the more it makes sense in contrast to him being a devil. But yeah, crazy chapter, no break next week. Give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works